This officer thought he was in control. He was wrong. And within the next few minutes, his entire career would begin collapsing in front of a crowd that was quietly starting to gather. The police lights behind them flickered across the street like a silent warning. Red, blue, red, blue. The officer's hand was clenched tightly around the front of the man's red jacket, pulling him closer as his voice rose louder with every word. "You think you can talk back to me?" the officer barked, his jaw tight with irritation. The man in the red jacket didn't raise his voice. He didn't shove back. He didn't argue. He just looked directly into the officer's eyes with a calm expression that almost seemed patient, which somehow made the officer even angrier. "You were told to keep walking," the officer snapped. "Instead, you decided to get smart." A small group of pedestrians had slowed down across the street. Phones were already starting to appear because something about the scene felt off. The officer was visibly furious, but the man he was gripping by the jacket wasn't reacting the way most people did. No panic, no yelling, no fear, just steady eye contact and a calm voice. "Officer," the man said quietly, "I'd recommend you let go of my jacket." That sentence made the officer laugh, a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, really?" he said. "You recommend?" He leaned closer, tightening his grip. "You don't recommend anything to me." The police cruiser behind them idled loudly. The flashing lights painted the officer's face in alternating colors. Red, blue, red, blue. But the man in the red jacket still didn't react. He simply took a slow breath and glanced briefly at the cruiser, then back at the officer. And that small glance would matter later. But no one watching understood that yet. The officer shook him slightly. "You got ID on you?" "Yes." "Then hand it over." The man didn't move. "I'll provide identification," he said calmly, "once you explain why I'm being detained." That sentence hit the officer like gasoline on a fire. "Oh, you're one of those guys," he said. His voice turned louder, performative, because now more people were watching. "Let me guess. You watched a few internet videos and now you think you're a lawyer." The man said nothing, just watched him. And that silence made the officer uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. Most confrontations escalated quickly. People argued. They got emotional. They tried to pull away. But this man was completely composed, and that calmness felt like defiance. The officer's partner stepped out of the cruiser now, walking around the front of the vehicle. "You got a problem over here?" the partner asked. The officer gestured at the man's jacket. "This guy thinks he doesn't have to cooperate." The partner looked at the man, then at the growing number of phones recording from the sidewalk, then back at the officer. "What's the stop for?" the partner asked quietly. The officer didn't answer right away. Because, technically, there wasn't one. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem had started 2 minutes earlier, when the officer had mistaken the man for someone else, someone who had been reported as suspicious, someone wearing a red jacket, someone walking near the financial district. But the officer hadn't verified anything before grabbing him, and now he had a crowd watching. So backing down would feel like losing control. Instead, he doubled down. "He refused to comply," the officer said. The man in the red jacket tilted his head slightly. "That's not accurate," he said calmly. The officer stepped closer again. "You want to test that theory downtown?" And for the first time, the man reached slowly toward his pocket. The officer's hand instantly moved toward his holster. "Whoa, stop!" the officer snapped. But the man's movement was slow, deliberate, non-threatening. He removed a small leather wallet, held it up. "Identification," he said. The officer snatched it aggressively, flipped it open, and immediately frowned, because the card inside wasn't a driver's license. It was something else, something official, But the officer only glanced at it for a second before scoffing. "Yeah, okay," he said. Then he looked at the man again. "You think flashing some fake badge is going to scare me?" The man blinked once. Slowly. "It isn't fake," he said. The officer rolled his eyes and tossed the wallet back against the man's chest. "Sure it isn't." But the partner had leaned closer. And the partner had actually read it. His expression shifted almost instantly, because the credential had a seal, a real one, and a name he recognized from a briefing 2 weeks earlier. The partner looked up at the man, then at the officer gripping his jacket, and suddenly the entire energy of the situation changed. But the officer didn't notice yet. He was still talking, still escalating. "You people think you can just walk around acting like you're above the law," he continued. But the partner interrupted him quietly. "Hey," the officer ignored him. "You think that little card means something?" The partner stepped closer. "Hey," he repeated, firmer this time. The officer finally glanced at him. "What?" The partner nodded slightly toward the man's wallet. "You might want to look at that again." The officer sighed dramatically. "Why?" But the partner didn't answer. He just stared. And there was something in that stare now. Something cautious. Because the name on that credential wasn't just a name. It belonged to a division most local departments preferred not to encounter unexpectedly. A division that had quietly appeared in several cities over the past year. A division connected to investigations that had ended more than a few careers. And the man standing calmly in the red jacket was listed as a senior investigator. Federal Oversight Division. A unit that almost nobody outside certain circles knew existed. The officer grabbed the wallet again, actually read it this time. And the first crack in his confidence appeared, just a flicker. Because suddenly he realized something. The calmness, the eye contact, the lack of fear. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. But that still wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the small black SUV that had just turned the corner at the end of the street. And the two people inside it. People who had been watching the entire interaction unfold from half a block away. People who worked for the same division as the man in the red jacket. And they had just finished recording everything. But the officer gripping the jacket didn't know that yet. And that detail everyone overlooked was about to change everything. The officer looked down at the credential again. This time, he didn't rush. His eyes moved slowly across the small lines of text. Name, division, authorization seal. And then, the signature. For a brief moment, the street noise around them seemed to fade. Cars moved through the intersection behind them. Pedestrians whispered across the sidewalk. Someone's phone camera zoomed in closer, but the officer's attention was locked on the badge in his hand because he suddenly recognized the seal, not from experience, but from warnings. Briefings that had circulated through the department over the past year. Briefings about a federal oversight unit that didn't announce its operations. A unit that showed up quietly, observed, recorded, and when necessary, dismantled entire chains of command. The officer looked up slowly. The man in the red jacket hadn't moved, still calm, still patient, still letting the moment unfold. "You're telling me," the officer began, his voice no longer as loud, "your federal oversight?" The man's expression didn't change. "I'm telling you," he said evenly, "that you grabbed a federal investigator without cause." The partner shifted his weight uncomfortably. The officer glanced at him, then back at the badge, then back at the man, and something dangerous happened in that moment. Instead of backing down, he laughed, a short, dismissive laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I'm not buying it." The partner immediately tensed. "Hey," but the officer wasn't finished. "Anyone can print a badge," he continued, raising his voice again. "You think flashing some fake federal card is going to scare me into letting you walk away?" Across the street, someone whispered, Is that guy federal? Another phone lifted into the air. The man in the red jacket spoke again, still calm, still controlled. "You've now had 2 opportunities to correct this," he said. The officer leaned closer again. "Or what?" The man looked at the officer's hand still gripping his jacket. "You escalate." The officer smirked. "Good." But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was happening half a block away. The black SUV had stopped at the curb, engine still running. 2 people stepped out, both wearing plain clothes, both carrying the same small leather credentials clipped inside their jackets. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They simply started walking down the sidewalk toward the scene, and one of them held a small device in his hand, still recording. Back at the confrontation, the officer shook the wallet again. "You expect me to believe this?" The man responded with a quiet sentence that barely rose above the sound of traffic. "I expect you to read it." The officer did. Again, this time slower. And this time, he noticed something he hadn't before. A case reference number printed beneath the seal, a number tied to an investigation, but that detail didn't mean anything to him. What did mean something? Was the partner suddenly speaking again? Quiet. Urgent. "Dan," the officer didn't look at him. "What?" "You should probably stay out of it." But the partner's voice dropped even lower. "That number," the officer frowned. "What about it?" The partner swallowed. "That's the same case code from the internal bulletin last month." Now the officer finally looked at him. And for the first time, the arrogance cracked. Because that bulletin hadn't been a rumor. It had been a warning. A quiet memo circulated through several departments across the region. It mentioned a growing investigation involving procurement contracts, evidence tampering, and something else. Private security firms operating under city authority. Most officers had ignored it, because those kinds of investigations usually stayed far away from street patrol. But the case code matched. Exactly. The officer looked down again, then slowly released his grip on the red jacket. But the damage had already been done, because the man adjusted the jacket calmly, straightened it, then spoke one quiet sentence. "You just crossed the threshold." The officer blinked. "What does that mean?" Before the man could answer, a new voice spoke from behind them. "It means this interaction is now part of the record." Both officers turned. The 2 people from the SUV had arrived. They stopped a few feet away. One of them held up his credential. Federal Oversight Division, the same seal, the same authority, and the same case number. The first officer's confidence vanished almost instantly. The partner stepped back slightly. The second investigator spoke calmly. "We've been observing this district for the past 3 weeks. The officer looked between them. "Observing what?" The investigator tilted his head slightly. "Your department." The words landed like a quiet explosion. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger now. Phones were everywhere. Someone whispered, "Oh man." The first investigator, the man in the red jacket, continued speaking. "This wasn't random." The officer shook his head. "You set me up?" "No," the investigator replied. "You revealed yourself." The second investigator raised the recording device slightly. "And you did it on camera." The officer looked at the growing number of witnesses, then back at the investigators. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You can't just show up and—" "We didn't just show up," the second investigator interrupted. He gestured toward the financial district behind them. "We've been reviewing stops in this area for months." The partner's face had gone pale, because suddenly everything made sense. The quiet audit requests, the strange data inquiries, the sealed emails from the chief's office. All of it. The officer pointed angrily. "This is harassment." The man in the red jacket shook his head. "No." Then he said something that made the partner's stomach drop. "This is phase 2." The officer frowned. "What?" The investigator looked directly at him. Your department wasn't the first city under review. The words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone whispered a name, a city where an entire command staff had quietly been replaced 6 months earlier, a story that had never fully reached the news. But that wasn't the real shock. The real shock came when the second investigator pulled a folded document from his jacket and handed it to the officer. A temporary notice, administrative hold, effective immediately. The officer stared at it. You're suspending me? The investigator shook his head. No! Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. We're suspending the entire unit. The crowd erupted into whispers. Phones zoomed in. The partner looked like he might collapse because the document listed more than one name, 7 officers, 2 supervisors, and a lieutenant, all connected to the same investigation, all tied to the same case number, and the officer standing there had just added his name to the top of the list. But even that wasn't the biggest problem, because the man in the red jacket leaned slightly closer and said something so quiet only the 2 officers could hear it. This investigation doesn't stop with your department. The officer's voice cracked slightly. What does that mean? The investigator's eyes didn't leave his. It means someone above you authorized what we've been finding. He paused, then added the line that would later echo through 3 different agencies. And we're getting closer. Across the street, the black SUV's engine was still running, because this city was only one stop in a much larger investigation, and the network they were uncovering went far higher than anyone watching that street could imagine. The street had gone quiet, not silent, but quiet in the way a crowd becomes quiet when people realize they're watching something bigger than a simple argument. Phones were still raised, cars slowed as they passed, and the officer stood frozen with the document still in his hand. 7 names, 2 supervisors, a lieutenant, and now, him. The man in the red jacket adjusted his sleeve slightly, watching the reaction unfold with the same calm patience he'd shown since the beginning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't celebrate, because this moment wasn't the end. It was confirmation. The officer's face had gone pale. You can't do this, he muttered. The second investigator responded immediately. We already did. The officer looked around, almost as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in and stop what was happening. But no one did, because something about the authority in the investigators' voices made it clear this situation was already decided. The partner took a step back. You're shutting down the whole unit? He asked quietly. The investigator nodded once. Effective immediately. But we didn't. You were listed on the operational chain. The partner's shoulders dropped, because he understood exactly what that meant. In oversight investigations, proximity mattered. If a pattern existed inside a unit, everyone connected to that pattern became part of the review, and that review could reach very far. The officer suddenly found his voice again. This is ridiculous, he said louder. You can't just walk in here and suspend people over a street stop. The investigator in the red jacket shook his head. We didn't. He gestured calmly toward the cruiser behind them. This stop is just the most recent entry. The officer stared. What are you talking about? The second investigator stepped forward slightly and pulled out a thin black tablet. He tapped the screen, then turned it outward. On the display were clips, short videos, dates, times, body cam footage, each one showing variations of the same pattern. Aggressive stops, unverified detentions, reports that didn't match recordings, and the same badge numbers appearing again and again, the officer's number among them. You've been under behavioral monitoring for 12 weeks, the investigator said. The officer shook his head in disbelief. That's illegal. No, the investigator replied calmly. It's federal oversight. The partner leaned closer to the screen, and his stomach dropped. Because one of the videos was from 2 weeks earlier, a stop he had been present for, a stop that had ended with paperwork that hadn't exactly matched what happened. He whispered under his breath, "Oh no." The officer looked at him sharply. "What?" But the partner didn't answer, because in that moment he realized something terrifying. This investigation hadn't started today. It hadn't started last week. It had started months ago, and every interaction since then had been quietly cataloged. The man in the red jacket closed the tablet. This city was flagged during a procurement review. The officer frowned. What does procurement have to do with patrol stops? The investigator held his gaze. Everything. But that wasn't the detail that unsettled the partner the most. The investigator continued. Private enforcement contracts. Now the partner understood. 6 months earlier, the city had approved a partnership with a security consulting firm. They called it an efficiency program. Budget optimization, resource management. But what it actually did was change how patrol quotas were monitored, how certain neighborhoods were targeted, how certain stops were encouraged, and how certain reports were adjusted. The officer laughed again, but this time it sounded strained. You're blaming a consulting company? No, the investigator said. We're tracing influence. The officer's eyes narrowed. You don't have anything. The investigator looked at him quietly. We have enough. The second investigator stepped forward again. And we have more coming. The officer pointed toward the crowd. You think this circus proves something? But the man in the red jacket slowly turned his head toward the sidewalk. Dozens of phones, every angle recorded, every word captured. This, he said quietly, is just documentation. The officer's voice rose again. You're trying to make an example out of me. The investigator nodded once. Yes. The blunt honesty stunned him, because there was no anger in the answer, just fact. But then the investigator added something else. You made yourself the example. A long silence settled over the street. The officer looked down at the suspension notice again. His hands trembled slightly. You think this ends my career? The investigator didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the black SUV. Another car had just pulled up behind it, unmarked, dark windows. The officer noticed it too. What is that? The investigator finally answered. That, he paused, is the next phase. The second vehicle's doors opened. 2 more individuals stepped out. One carried a sealed briefcase. The other carried a thin folder stamped with a familiar seal. But this one wasn't from the Federal Oversight Division. The partner saw it first, and his face drained of color, because the seal belonged to another agency. An agency that didn't arrive unless things had already gone far beyond administrative discipline. The officer squinted. What agency is that? The man in the red jacket looked back at him calmly. You're about to find out. The 2 officials approached slowly. The one holding the folder stopped beside the investigators and opened it. Inside were warrants, subpoenas, authorization orders. He looked at the officer directly. Officer Daniel Mercer? The officer's throat tightened. Yes. The man nodded. You are being formally notified that this department is now subject to a joint federal investigation. The officer blinked. For what? The official closed the folder slowly. For facilitating enforcement operations influenced by an external corporate entity currently under federal review. The officer frowned. I don't even know what that means. The man in the red jacket spoke again. It means someone outside your department has been shaping how law enforcement operates in the city. The officer shook his head. That's impossible. The investigator tilted his head slightly. Is it? Then he said the sentence that made the partner feel like the ground had shifted beneath them. The same corporation flagged in Chicago. A ripple moved through the crowd because that story had surfaced briefly months ago, then vanished, quietly. The officer stared. That case was closed. The investigator's eyes stayed locked on his. "No," he said softly. It moved. The second official snapped the briefcase open. Inside were more documents, more names, more departments, more cities. And at the top of the first page, one name appeared again. A private security consulting firm, the same firm the city had partnered with. But the investigator closed the case before anyone else could read further. Because that information wasn't for the street. Not yet. The officer whispered, "How big is this?" The investigator answered with the calm certainty he had carried since the beginning. "Bigger than this department." He gestured slightly toward the city skyline. "Bigger than this city." The officer's voice dropped to almost nothing. "How many cities?" The investigator paused, just long enough for the tension to settle. Then he delivered the final line. "More than you'd be comfortable knowing." And somewhere inside that growing network of investigations, a name had already appeared, a corporate entity quietly influencing departments across multiple states, an organization that had been operating in the shadows for years. But now, the investigation had finally reached them. And this street stop was only the moment the public first noticed, because the real story had just begun.